The ocean stretched endlessly, a canvas of chaos painted in crashing waves and the roar of cannon fire. Monkey D. Luffy stood at the bow of the Thousand Sunny, his straw hat tilted back, grin carved across his face like a declaration of war against impossibility itself. Before him rose a creature of nightmares, a sea king so vast its shadow turned day into twilight, scales gleaming like obsidian monuments to ancient hunger. Its roar shattered the air, a sound that should have broken spirits and sent men scrambling for mercy. Luffy laughed, not the nervous laughter of fear masquerading as courage, but something purer joy distilled into sound, the kind of defiance that doesn't recognize the concept of odds. His crew shouted warnings, calculations of power and probability, but those words dissolved in the wind. Numbers meant nothing to a man whose will burned hotter than reason. He stretched his arm back, rubber flesh elongating impossibly, muscles coiling with tension that defied every law physics had ever whispered. The world seemed to pause, holding its breath. Then he launched forward. The impact of his gum-gum bazooka struck like a meteor kissed by determination itself, sending the Sea King reeling backward, its massive form crashing through waves that erupted into mountains of spray. Luffy's laughter echoed across the ocean, a sound so infectious it made hopelessness seem like the real impossibility. Across the galaxy, in a place where stars burned cold and ambition wore masks of ideology, another story carved itself into existence with screams instead of laughter. Kylo Ren's lightsaber ignited, that distinctive crimson blade crackling with barely contained fury, its unstable energy mirroring the storm inside its wielder. He stood in a command chamber aboard a star destroyer, the sterile perfection of imperial design surrounding him like a cage dressed as power. Before him knelt an officer who had failed the mission, failed the order, failed the vision of control that Kylo served with religious fervor and personal desperation. The officer pleaded. Words tumbled out about logistics, about variables beyond control, about the unpredictable nature of rebellion. Each excuse was a nail in his own coffin, though he didn't realize excuses and explanations sounded identical to a man who had never forgiven himself for anything. Kylo's hand extended, fingers curling as the Force answered his rage. The officer's throat constricted, feet lifting from the polished floor as invisible pressure mounted. In that moment, Kylo Ren saw not an incompetent subordinate but a reflection of every failure. Every moment of weakness, every time Ben Solo had disappointed those who expected greatness. The darkness inside him howled, demanding tribute, demanding proof that he had transcended the pathetic boy who once believed in mercy. But his hand trembled. Somewhere beneath the mask, beneath the layers of cultivated cruelty and practiced domination, something screamed. Not in triumph like Luffy's battle cry, but in agony, the sound of a soul trying to strangle its own light while that light refused to die quietly. The officer dropped, gasping, alive but marked by proximity to a man at war with his own existence. Supreme Leader Snoke's voice invaded Kylo's mind like poison dressed as wisdom, mocking his hesitation, questioning his commitment to power. The words burrowed deep, finding every insecurity and watering them with contempt. Kylo's rage surged again, but this time it had nowhere to go except inward, a black hole consuming itself. Neither manned the pirate sailing seas of literal water. The night drowning in metaphorical darkness knew that ancient mechanisms were stirring. Deep in the hidden corners of their respective realities, where law's existence grew thin and possibility bled through cracks in certainty, something awakened. In Luffy's world, it was a forgotten island shrine where joy and will had once been worshipped as gods. In Kylo's universe, it was a Force nexus older than the Jedi, older than the Sith, a place where destiny itself learned to bend. Both locations pulsed with recognition. The Force, that mystical energy binding all things, felt Luffy's indomitable will rippling across dimensional barriers like sonar finding something that shouldn't exist. It felt a consciousness so pure in its freedom that it registered as an anomaly, no fear to manipulate, no doubt to exploit, no destiny to fulfill. Just hunger, joy, and a laugh that mocked the very concept of inevitability. Simultaneously, The nexus in Luffy's world detected Kylo, a storm of potential wrapped in chains of choice, a destiny so violently rejected it created gravitational pull. Power without peace, strength without satisfaction, a walking contradiction that reality itself found fascinating. The universes leaned closer. Space began to tear, not dramatically at first, but with the subtle wrongness of reality noticing it had left a door unlocked. Around Luffy, the ocean started behaving strangely, waves moving in geometric patterns that water had no business understanding. His crew noticed, shouting observations about whirlpools forming spirals that seemed to rotate through dimensions instead of just water. Luffy, of course, thought it looked cool. Around Kylo, the Force screamed. Every sensitive aboard the Star Destroyer clutched their heads as something massive and incomprehensible brushed against their consciousness. Alarms blared, not because of mechanical failure but because the ship's sensors detected spatial anomalies that violated every known principle of astrophysics. Reality was cracking, and cracks, once started, tend to spread. The tiers opened simultaneously in Luffy's world, a brilliant crimson wound in the sky above the ocean, edges crackling with energy that smelled like ozone and tasted like destiny having a crisis. In Kylo's chamber, a matching rift, but darker, as though space itself was bruised. Both portals pulsed with invitation and inevitability. Luffy's instinct was simple: mysterious thing equals adventure. He reached for it. Kylo's instinct was control. Anomaly equals threat. He attacked it with the Force. Both were wrong. Both were right. The rifts didn't ask permission. They swallowed their targets whole, gulping down a pirate who laughed at the universe and a knight who screamed at himself, pulling them into a space between spaces where two realities would collide with consequences neither could predict. The last sound in Luffy's world was his crew shouting his name. The last sound in Kylo's world was his own Force signature, fragmenting like glass under pressure. And somewhere, in the space between laughter and screams, destiny realized it had encountered something it couldn't script. The void between worlds had no name because naming requires understanding, and understanding requires rules, and this place had decided rules were optional suggestions at best. Kylo Ren tumbled through dimensional flux, his connection to the Force amplifying into something approaching religious experience, if that religion worshipped cosmic horror and existential vertigo. He could feel everything and nothing. The dark side surged around him like a living ocean, whispering promises of power in languages that predated language itself. Every regret, every moment of rage, every drop of shame he'd ever buried came flooding back with crystal clarity. The Force here didn't just touch his mind, it invaded, dissected, displayed his soul like a specimen pinned to cosmic glass. He saw himself through countless perspectives. The disappointment in his mother's eyes, the betrayal in his father's final moment, the cold calculation in Snoke's evaluation of his worth. But there was something else in the void, something the Force kept circling like a predator that couldn't classify its prey. Luffy drifted through the same impossible space with a completely different experience. Where Kylo felt the crushing weight of infinite possibility, Luffy felt hungry.
And curious.
And maybe a little motion sick, but in a fun way. Like that time he'd been launched from a cannon while fighting a clown with a devil fruit power. The metaphysical implications of existing between universes didn't register as philosophical crisis, they registered as really weird. And Luffy had built his entire worldview on embracing really weird. The dark side currents that coiled around Kylo like serpents of condensed despair approached Luffy with predatory intent. They probed for fear nothing. They searched for doubt, not even a concept he entertained. They tried to amplify his darkest desires and found only simple hungers.
Food. Adventure. Protecting his friends.
Dreams so straightforward they were almost offensive to cosmic forces that dealt in complexity and corruption. The darkness recoiled, confused. Luffy's willpower existed in a state the Force had never encountered. It wasn't resistance like the Jedi practiced, that disciplined meditation and carefully constructed mental fortresses. It wasn't the Sith's domination, that aggressive subjugation of weakness through strength. It was something more fundamental, a will so absolute in its simplicity that it created a kind of Invulnerability through sheer refusal to acknowledge limitations as anything but temporary inconveniences. The Force pressed harder, trying to map this anomaly onto frameworks it understood.
Was this the light side?
No, too instinctive, lacking the mindfulness that defined Jedi philosophy.
Was it darkness? Absolutely not. There was no hatred here, no fear to ferment into power.
Was it balance? That came closest, but balance implied awareness of opposing forces, and Luffy didn't balance anything. He simply was, with the kind of presence that made the universe adjust around him rather than vice versa. Kylo felt this presence like a star burning in the void, impossible to ignore, painful to observe directly, and fundamentally incomprehensible. Through the Force, he perceived Luffy's existence as a singularity of will that bent probability around it. No destiny, no grand design, no cosmic chess game. Just a human-shaped declaration that freedom wasn't something to be granted by fate, but something to be seized and laughed about.
It infuriated him. It fascinated him.
It terrified him. Because if someone could exist like that, so utterly unconstrained by the weight of legacy, expectation, and destiny, what did that say about Kylo's own chains? He'd spent years convincing himself that power required sacrifice, that strength demanded darkness, that letting go of Ben Solo was the price of becoming Kylo Ren. But here was someone with power that felt natural as breathing, strength that came from joy rather than suffering, and an identity so secure it didn't need a mask. The void began to solidify, reality remembering how to be real again. Images flickered past, glimpses of the destination universe, a galaxy far from both their origins. Kylo saw Imperial Star Destroyers, TIE fighters screaming through space, the cold machinery of authoritarian control stretched across star systems. Recognition jolted through him. This was his reality, or something terribly close to it. The Empire, or perhaps the First Order in its earlier incarnation, spreading its vision of peace through domination. Luffy saw the same images and had a simpler reaction. Those ships looked like the world government's vessels, just uglier and in space. And where there was oppression, there were people who needed someone to stand between them and the boot trying to crush them. His fists clenched reflexively, rubber knuckles tightening with anticipation. The force between them hummed with tension, trying to reconcile how two beings so fundamentally different could exist in proximity without one paradigm destroying the other. Kylo's destiny-bound existence versus Luffy's destiny-defying presence.
Control versus chaos. Suffering as currency versus joy as comfort.
The metaphysical clash created ripples that would echo across the galaxy they were approaching. In those final moments before transition, Kylo made a decision, or perhaps the decision made itself through him. He would master this anomaly, understand it, control it, and through that process prove that his path remained superior. Power through dominance, strength through the dark side, destiny fulfilled through submission to a greater design. This laughing fool who treated universal forces like a joke would learn what happened when someone faced a true Knight of Ren. Luffy's decision was simpler. Whoever was in charge of this weird tunnel thing, he better have food ready, because he was starving. Also, that angry guy radiating murder vibes seemed like he probably needed a friend.
Or a punch. Maybe both.
Luffy had found that punches and friendship often went hand in hand, especially with the really stubborn people. The void contracted, reality snapped back into focus. And two impossibilities were born into a galaxy that had no idea it was about to have its foundations shaken by a pirate who laughed at fate, and a knight who was about to learn that some wills cannot be broken, only proven correct through the breaking of everything else. They emerged not as allies, not as enemies, but as opposing philosophies given flesh and thrust into a universe where both the Empire and the Force itself would struggle to define what had just arrived. They materialized on different worlds, as if reality itself understood that putting them in immediate proximity would trigger detonation rather than introduction. Luffy crashed into existence on a planet designated in Imperial records as Tarlanus Primi, factory world where freedom had been efficiently processed out of the population 3 generations ago. The architecture spoke of optimization over beauty, every building a gray monument to productivity. every street designed for orderly transport of resources rather than the messy unpredictability of life actually being lived. He landed in a marketplace that had forgotten what markets were supposed to feel like. Vendors sold their state-mandated goods with the enthusiasm of people who'd learned that enthusiasm drew unwanted attention. Stormtroopers patrolled in pairs, white armor gleaming with the kind of cleanliness that only comes from never actually having to get dirty with real combat. Citizens walked with eyes down, speaking in hushed tones, practicing the art of invisibility that oppressed people perfect out of necessity. Luffy stood up, brushed cosmic dust off his vest, adjusted his straw hat, and immediately broke every unspoken rule of survival in Imperial space by asking loudly, "Where can I get some meat?" The marketplace froze. Silence spread like ice, brittle and dangerous. Heads turned with the mechanical precision of people watching an accident in progress, horrified but unable to look away. The stormtroopers pivoted, blasters raising with rehearsed efficiency. "Citizen, identify yourself," one demanded through his helmet's voice modulator, the sound stripped of personality until it resembled a droid's approximation of authority. Luffy squinted at them, head tilting with genuine confusion.
I'm Luffy. Who are you guys supposed to be?
The troopers interpreted this as resistance. Imperial protocol was clear about resistance. Scrush it immediately, publicly, as educational theater for anyone else considering individualism. They opened fire, blaster bolts screaming through air that suddenly smelled of ozone and superheated particles. The civilians scattered, desperate to avoid becoming collateral damage in another of the Empire's countless demonstrations. The bolts hit Luffy center mass.
And bound.
Not deflected by technology or the Force, not absorbed by armor or energy shields. They hit rubber flesh that simply refused to acknowledge blaster physics as relevant to the current situation. Luffy's body stretched on impact, holes forming and immediately rebounding, the energy dissipating harmlessly as his devil fruit power treated Imperial weapons technology like a minor inconvenience. Luffy looked down at himself, then at the stormtroopers, then broke into a massive grin. That tickled. Do it again. The troopers did, because backup had arrived and Imperial training emphasized overwhelming force over tactical reassessment. A dozen blasters fired in concert, the air filling with crimson death that should have reduced any unarmored human to smoking meat. Instead, Luffy laughed, his body ballooning and contracting, stretching and rebounding, turning their coordinated assault into an impromptu physics demonstration on why conventional weapons and rubber-based devil fruit users were fundamentally incompatible. Then he counterattacked, not from malice but from the simple understanding that these guys were clearly the bad guys, and bad guys needed punching. His arm stretched across the marketplace, rubber limb extending impossibly, wrapping around 3 stormtroopers before yanking back. The gum-gum whip sent them flying through the air like toys thrown by a particularly enthusiastic child, their white armor clattering across cobblestones in a percussion of Imperial incompetence. The civilians stared, cultural conditioning warring with the impossible evidence of their eyes.
Someone had just hit Stormtrooper. Someone had laughed at Imperial might.
Someone was currently using 2 troopers as improvised nunchucks to beat up their squad mates, and he was grinning like this was the most fun he'd had all week. A child laughed, quickly stifled by his mother's hand, but not quickly enough. That single sound of joy in a place that had forgotten joy existed rippled through the crowd like sedition's first whisper. Meanwhile, across 3 star systems, Kylo Ren's arrival was considerably less amusing and infinitely more terrifying. He emerged aboard an Imperial Star Destroyer, the Finalizer's spiritual predecessor, its corridors haunted by the same aesthetic of intimidation through sterile perfection. Officers snapped to attention as his presence washed over them, the Force announcing him like trumpets made of dread. They didn't know who he was, not precisely, but they knew power when they felt it crushing their consciousness at the edges. "Identify yourself," a commander demanded, though his voice carried the quaver of a man suddenly aware he was gambling with death. Kylo's lightsaber ignited in response, that unstable blade casting crimson shadows that danced like demons given permission. "I am Kylo Ren," he declared, voice carrying the weight of someone who'd practiced turning introductions into apocalyptic pronouncements. and you will serve the First Order." The commander's confusion was genuine. The First Order wasn't a designation he recognized. But the lightsaber was very recognizable, and more importantly, the dark side rolling off this masked figure felt like standing in a blast radius of concentrated will and weaponized anger. Imperial officers were trained to recognize power's pecking order and adjust accordingly. "Of course, Lord Ren," the commander managed, survival instincts overriding protocol. "What are your orders?" Kylo paused. He'd expected resistance, combat, the need to carve his authority from their corpses and fear. Instead, he'd found an organization that already understood obedience to force wielders, already had infrastructure designed for exactly the kind of authoritarian control he'd been raised to enforce. This was his galaxy, or close enough that the differences felt cosmetic rather than fundamental. But something was wrong. The force here felt different, denser, older, carrying echoes that didn't match his timeline. And there was that presence, that infuriating bright point of will that his senses tracked even across the void of space. The anomaly. The pirate. The one who laughed. "Scan all Imperial frequencies," Kylo commanded. "Find me reports of impossible events, weapons failures, unexplained resistance, anything that defies standard probability." Within hours, reports flooded in. On Tarlonis Prime, an entire garrison had been defeated by a single individual displaying impossible abilities. Blasters ineffective. Stormtroopers literally tied in knots. Civilians emboldened. The Empire's facade of invincibility cracked by someone who apparently treated their military as a warm-up exercise. Kylo stared at the reports, his fists clenching. The Force showed him glimpses: a straw hat, a reckless grin, a will that bent reality through sheer refusal to acknowledge limitations. His rage built, not just at the chaos but at what it represented. Freedom without consequence. Power without suffering. Joy without darkness. Everything his philosophy rejected, walking around proving him wrong just by existing. "Prepare my ship," he ordered, voice cold as vacuum. "I'm going to Tarlonis Prime." He would find this anomaly. He would understand it. He would break it, or it would break him, and honestly, at this point, Kylo Ren wasn't entirely sure which outcome he feared more. In the hidden enclaves where Force-sensitives still gathered, those who'd survived the purges, who practiced their philosophies in the shadows like monks preserving forbidden text, Luffy's arrival registered as an earthquake in the mystical currents. They felt him not as a presence but as an absence. A void in destiny's tapestry where someone was supposed to have a fate and simply didn't bother showing up to the appointment. On the moon of Getha's lesser cousin, where a handful of former Jedi maintained their vigil, an old master named Korvan suddenly dropped his meditation beads. His Padawan looked up, concerned, as the master's eyes went distant with the specific focus of someone perceiving something through the Force that their physical senses rejected as impossible. "There is a new player on the board," Korvan whispered, aged voice carrying the tremor of certainty and confusion fighting for dominance. "But he doesn't know there is a board, doesn't acknowledge the game. He simply moves, and the board adjusts around him." The Padawan, still young enough to believe Force visions came with clear instruction manuals, asked the obvious question: "Is he light or dark?" Korvan laughed, a sound rusty from disuse. "Neither. Both. The question itself offends whatever he is. It's like asking if a storm is light or dark. It simply is. And everything else must deal with the consequences." Similar conversations rippled across the galaxy wherever Force sensitivity pooled. Dark side adepts felt Luffy's presence as an insult to their philosophy. Power existed to be seized through strength and cunning. Yet here was someone who possessed power without having properly suffered for it. He hadn't earned it through anguish or sacrifice or the careful cultivation of hatred. He just had it, used it, laughed about it. For dark side practitioners who'd built entire identities around pain as currency, this was theological heresy. The Force itself seemed confused, treating Luffy like a sensor anomaly that kept returning positive results despite making no sense. Prophecies didn't mention him because he existed outside the framework where prophecies operated. The Chosen One mythology, that grand narrative of balance and destiny, looked at Luffy and experienced what might be called cosmic cognitive dissonance. He was significant without being prophesied, powerful without being chosen, destiny-shaping without having a destiny. He was, in the most fundamental sense, free. Kylo Ren felt all of this through his connection to the Force, and it made him want to scream. Or did scream his quarters aboard the Star Destroyer bore fresh lightsaber scars on the walls where he vented fury at the universe's apparent decision to mock everything he'd sacrificed to become who he was. The Force showed him visions, whether he wanted them or not, because the Force had opinions about irony and enjoyed making its students confront their shadows. He saw himself through Luffy's through what Luffy would see if he bothered analyzing Kylo at all. A man wearing a mask because he was afraid of the face underneath. Wielding power not from confidence but from desperate need to prove something to everyone, especially himself. Claiming strength through the dark side while being enslaved by anger, which meant he wasn't strong at all. Just loud. Just broken. Just a boy playing at being a monster because he'd convinced himself that monsters were stronger than men. The vision cut deeper than any lightsaber. Kylo tried to reject it, to force push it out of his consciousness, but it had the sticky quality of truth that refuses dismissal.
He thought of his grandfather, Darth Vader, and for the first time wondered if Anakin Skywalker's fall to the dark side had been strength, or just the most elaborate form of weakness ever disguised as power.
No.
He rejected that. He had to reject that. If power through suffering was a lie, if destiny through darkness was just slavery with better marketing, then what had he sacrificed Ben Solo for? What did it mean that he'd killed his own father? The Force offered no answers, only more questions, each one sharpened on the whetstone of that laughing pirate's existence. Elsewhere, Luffy was having a much simpler time philosophically. He'd liberated Tarlones Prime's marketplace by the simple expedient of punching every stormtrooper who tried to stop people from living freely, then sharing his food with the locals, then falling asleep in the middle of the public square like someone who'd never learned that tyrannical regimes get upset when you treat their territory as a napping spot. The citizens surrounded him, torn between terror at the inevitable imperial reprisal and awe at watching someone treat invincible authority as a minor inconvenience. One woman, braver than most, approached the sleeping pirate and gently adjusted his straw hat so it wouldn't blow away in the wind. "Who are you?" she whispered, not expecting an answer from someone clearly unconscious. Luffy's eye cracked open, that lazy smile spreading across his face. "I'm Luffy. I'm going to be king of the pirates." The proclamation meant nothing to her. Pirates in this galaxy were small-time criminals, not mythological figures of freedom. But the way he said it, the absolute conviction that this nonsensical dream was already true, just waiting for reality to catch up, that meant something. "Can you teach us?" she asked, voice breaking. "To be like you? To not be afraid?" Luffy sat up, confused. "I can't teach you to not be afraid. I just don't think about being afraid. There's too much other stuff to think about, like adventure and meat and protecting my friends." He paused, considering. "But I can teach you something else. If someone's hurting you or your friends, you hit them. Hard. Until they stop. That usually works." It was the worst tactical advice and the most profound philosophy she'd ever heard. Above them, Imperial Star Destroyers were already adjusting course, converging on Tarlones Prime with the specific intention of making an example. And aboard the lead vessel, Kylo Ren meditated on the nature of freedom and control, his mind a storm that the dark side amplified rather than calmed. Preparing to meet a man who would answer every question Kylo had ever asked with a punch and a laugh. The Imperial war machine descended on Tarlones Prime with the precision of a scalpel and the subtlety of a sledgehammer. 3 Star Destroyers emerged from hyperspace in perfect formation, their wedge-shaped hulls blotting out the system's sun, casting shadows across the planet that felt less like eclipse and more like prophecy. From their bellies, TIE fighters poured like hornets from a kick nest, their distinctive shriek filling atmosphere that had learned to associate that sound with compliance or death. Grand Moff Therinus commanded the operation from his flagship's bridge, A man whose face had forgotten how to smile somewhere between his third massacre and his fourth promotion. His strategic doctrine was simple. Overwhelming force applied without hesitation or mercy. Because doubt was the virus that killed empires. The reports from Tarlonis Prime offended him personally. A single individual causing this level of disruption suggested weakness in the imperial structure. And weakness had to be cauterized before it metastasized. Deploy ATAT walkers to all major population centers, he ordered, voice carrying the emotional range of a tax form. Establish kill zones in a 3-kilometer radius around the target's last known position. Civilian casualties are acceptable. This is a teaching moment for the sector. The plan was elegant in its brutality. Force the target to reveal himself by making survival require action. Innocence threatened. The anomaly would either save them or prove himself a coward. Either way, Imperial forces would triangulate his position and end this embarrassment with extreme prejudice. Kylo Ren stood on the bridge, a dark pillar among gray-uniformed efficiency. His presence making officers nervous in ways they couldn't articulate. The force churned around him, anticipation mixing with something he refused to identify as eagerness. Through the viewport, Tarlonis Prime grew larger, and his senses locked onto that infuriating signature of will without doubt. Your strategy will fail, Kylo said, not looking at Theranos. The Grand Moff stiffened. Lord Ren, we've crushed 1,000 rebellions with this isn't a rebellion.
It's a singularity.
Kylo's masked face turned toward him. You're not facing an organization or ideology. You're facing something that doesn't process threats the way you expect. Theranos managed to look both offended and uncertain, a combination that fit poorly on a face designed for authoritarian confidence. Then what do you suggest? Nothing. Proceed. I want to watch what happens when order meets chaos that doesn't know it's supposed to lose.
On the planet's surface,
Luffy was helping rebuild a market stall he'd accidentally destroyed during the previous day's festivities being his word for the spontaneous festival that erupted when people realized the stormtroopers were too unconscious to enforce curfew. He was terrible at construction, his enthusiasm vastly exceeding his carpentry skills, but the locals appreciated the effort even as they quietly fixed his mistakes. Then the sky darkened. Citizens looked up in horror. They remembered from childhood stories their parents told as warnings. The star destroyers hung in orbit like guillotine blades, visible even through atmosphere, while TIE fighters began their descent in attack formations that had been refined through decades of suppressing hope. Luffy squinted upward, one hand holding his straw hat against the wind those fighters generated.
those guys again.
They really don't learn, huh? An old man grabbed his arm, desperation making him bold. You have to run. They'll destroy the entire city to get to you. Please, we'll say you left, we'll tell them anything. Why would I run? Luffy asked, genuinely confused. They're picking on people who can't fight back. That means I gotta stop them. You're one person. They're an empire. Luffy's grin could have powered solar panels. Yeah, but I'm really strong. It'll be fine. The first wave of TIE fighters opened fire, strafing runs designed to herd civilians into designated kill zones. Buildings exploded, streets erupted in flames, and the air filled with screams. This was standard Imperial doctrine. Make resistance cost so much that survival through submission seemed like mercy. Luffy moved, not with strategy or tactical planning, but with the direct simplicity of someone who saw problems and solved them with force applied at high velocity. His legs compressed, gear second activating in a burst of steam and accelerated blood flow that turned his body into a weapon systems engineers couldn't have designed better if they'd tried. He launched skyward, stretching toward a TIE fighter with an extended arm that grabbed its wing. Momentum and rubber elasticity combining to redirect its trajectory into its wingman. Both fighters exploded in fireballs that briefly made the sky look like celebration instead of apocalypse. On the ground, the ATAT walkers stomped through streets too narrow for their bulk, crushing infrastructure with mechanical indifference. Each step shook buildings, a rhythm of dominance that announced the futility of resistance. Gun turrets rotated, targeting systems locking onto anything that moved with hostile intent. Luffy landed in front of one, looking up at the mechanical monster with the critical eye of someone evaluating an interesting new opponent. "You're big," he observed. "But big just means easier to hit." The Atat fired massive laser cannons that could reduce Duracrete fortifications to molten slag. Luffy dodged Deno, flowed around the beams. Rubber body stretching in impossible angles as observation Haki predicted trajectories before they fully formed. Then he coiled his arms back, muscles bulging with armament Haki that turned them black and diamond hard, and unleashed a gum-gum Gatling that struck the walker's front leg thousands of times in 3 seconds. Metal screamed. The leg buckled, support structure pulverized by impacts that treated advanced alloy like aluminum foil. The Atat toppled, its pilots screaming as tons of Imperial engineering became a very expensive and very lethal lawn ornament. Kylo felt it all through the Force. Each Imperial failure registered like a needle to his consciousness. Not because he cared about Imperial victory, but because he was witnessing something his training said was impossible. One person against coordinated. Military might shouldn't work. The numbers didn't support it. Strategy didn't support it. Reality didn't support it. But Luffy didn't care what reality supported. "Deploy all forces," Varanus commanded, voice cracking around the edges. "I want that thing dead now." The Empire poured everything available into Tarloni's prime stormtroopers in the thousands. Walkers by the dozen, orbital bombardment coordinates being calculated. Chemical weapons being unsealed. This had escalated from teaching moment to existential threat to Imperial credibility. One anomaly had to die, publicly and messily, or every oppressed world would start wondering if invincibility was just really good marketing. Luffy stood in the city center, surrounded by grateful civilians he'd saved and incoming military assets that wanted him very dead, and cracked his knuckles with anticipation. Through the smoke and fire, through the chaos of collapsing Imperial strategy, he felt something else approaching, something angry, something powerful, something that felt like a challenge. He grinned wider. "Finally, someone strong to fight." Kylo Ren descended from the sky on a command shuttle, lightsaber already ignited, dark side presence rolling before him like a tsunami of weaponized conviction. The Force screamed that collision was imminent. Order versus chaos, destiny versus freedom,
Suffering versus joy. The galaxy held its breath.
They met in the ruins of a government plaza, where Imperial statues lay toppled and propaganda screens flickered with static. The Empire's carefully constructed narrative literally crumbling under the weight of a single man's refusal to be impressed. Kylo Ren landed with theatrical precision, his shuttle's ramp descending like a stage for apocalypse. Dark robes billowing in winds that carried smoke and the metallic scent of destroyed machinery. Luffy looked up from sharing his canteen with an injured civilian, water dripping down his chin as he squinted at the new arrival. "Oh, you're the angry guy from the weird tunnel. You find any good food yet?" Kylo ignited his lightsaber in response, that distinctive crossguard blade crackling with unstable fury, its crimson light painting the debris field in shades of violence. The Force amplified his presence. Dark side energy rolling outward in waves designed to crush hope and broadcast inevitability. Every Jedi he'd faced had felt this and known fear. Every Imperial officer had felt this and known submission. Luffy felt it and tilted his head.
Curious. What's that buzzing feel?
"You doing that?" The complete absence of fear, not suppression, not meditation, not the Jedi's practiced serenity, but genuine lack of the concept registering as relevant hit Kylo like a slap to his philosophical foundation. He reached out through the Force, trying to find leverage in this anomaly's mind. Fear of death.
Nothing. Fear of failure? Non-existent.
Fear of loss. Present, but so fiercely protected by loyalty it formed an impenetrable core rather than exploitable weakness. "You destroyed Imperial property," Kylo stated, voice modulated through his mask into something between human and hurricane. "Killed soldiers.
Spread chaos. You will answer for this defiance."
Luffy stood up, wiping water from his mouth with the back of his hand. "Those guys were bullying people. I don't like bullies." Simple statement, profound philosophy, delivered with the conviction of someone who'd never doubted his moral compass for a microsecond. You understand nothing of order. Kylo snarled, rage building because this should be simple: overpower the target, break their will, establish dominance. But how did you break a will that didn't recognize breakage as possible? Nothing of the peace that comes through strength.
Nothing of destiny.
I understand meat, Luffy replied cheerfully, and adventure.
And my friends. And punching bad guys. That seems like plenty. Kylo struck.
He launched forward with Force enhanced speed, lightsaber arcing toward Luffy's neck in a strike designed to decapitate defiance literally. The blade, superheated plasma contained by magnetic fields,
Could cut through Durasteel like paper.
It hit Luffy's armament, haki-coated arm, and the galaxy learned something new about what happened when lightsabers met willpower given physical form. Sparks. Resistance. The blade didn't penetrate, sliding off blackened rubber flesh like water off oil. Luffy's arm stretched, grabbing Kylo's wrist, and suddenly the Knight of Ren found himself yanked forward with impossible strength. His trajectory redirected into a punch that caught him across the masked face hard enough to send him tumbling through rubble. Kylo rose, mask cracked, tasting blood behind the metal. The Force screamed warnings his training hadn't prepared him for. This wasn't fighting a Force user. Those battles followed rules, patterns, predictable exchanges of attack and defense. This was fighting a natural disaster that happened to be shaped like a grinning idiot. He tried Force choke. Luffy's rubber neck stretched, accommodating the pressure without cutting off airflow.
That tickles.
He tried Force push. Luffy's body compressed like a spring, absorbed the kinetic energy, then snapped back, launching himself forward with the added momentum into a gum-gum bazooka that caught Kylo's center mass and sent him crashing through a wall. He tried precognition, using the Force to predict movements before they happened. And there, finally, was a sensation he recognized.
Luffy had something similar.
Not the Force, but something equally mystical, a sense of incoming danger that operated on instinct rather than cosmic connection. Their precognitions clashed, creating a strange dance where both fighters knew what was coming but interpreted the information through completely different paradigms. Kylo adapted because, for all his emotional instability, he was a trained combatant who'd survived fights against multiple Jedi. He stopped trying to overpower and started trying to outmaneuver, using Force speed to create angles. Lightsaber work becoming more surgical. He scored hits, shallow cuts that would have bisected normal opponents but barely singed rubber flesh protected by haki. Luffy laughed, not mockingly but with genuine enjoyment. "You're pretty good."
This is fun. Fun.
The word detonated something in Kylo's chest. This wasn't fun. This was combat, survival, the ultimate test of worth and destiny. How dare this anomaly treat existential confrontation like entertainment? How dare he enjoy what should be suffering? How dare he have power without earning it through pain?
You mock everything.
Kylo roared, Force-enhanced voice cracking stone. Power without purpose.
Strength without sacrifice. You're a child playing out.
Luffy's fist caught him mid-rant, gear third expanding the limb to giant proportions that contradicted anatomy and physics equally. The blow launched Kylo through 3 buildings, his trajectory ending in a crater that smoked with impact heat. He lay there, body screaming pain. His dark side training taught him to convert to power, and felt something shift. Not defeat. He was too proud, too stubborn, too committed to his path for surrender.
But recognition. This anomaly had
Power that rivaled, perhaps exceeded his own. Power gained not through decades of training or careful cultivation of hatred, but through what?
joy?
Freedom? The simple decision to be strong because it was useful for protecting what he loved. Kylo Ren pulled himself from the crater, mask half destroyed, face visible beneath young, scarred, haunted by choices and genetics equally. He looked at Luffy, really looked, and saw something that terrified him more than any enemy ever had. Someone completely at peace with who they were. "This isn't over," Kylo rasped. "Cool. Round 2 later then?" Luffy beamed. "After lunch?" Despite everything, pain, pride, ideology, Kylo almost laughed. Almost. Instead, he retreated, Force pulling himself back to the Imperial forces, mind churning with implications he wasn't ready to process. Above,
Theranos made a decision born of desperation.
Orbital bombardment.
If one anomaly couldn't be contained, the entire city would burn. Luffy looked skyward, sensing the incoming danger, and his expression shifted. No more playfulness, just determination. Guess I gotta break that big ship now. The orbital bombardment calculations completed with bureaucratic efficiency. Coordinates locked onto Tarloni's Prime's capital with the cold precision of people who'd convinced themselves mass murder was just comprehensive strategy. Theranos stared at his screen, watching numbers that represented lives reduced to acceptable losses. His finger hovered over the authorization command, the weight of genocide feeling surprisingly light after years of conditioning. Then Kylo Ren's voice cut through the bridge's ordered tension.
Delay that order.
Officers exchanged glances, caught between two sources of authority they equally feared. Theranos turned, irritation cracking through his disciplined facade. Lord Ren, we cannot allow this insurgent to, I said, delay. Kylo's mask was ruined enough to reveal one eye, dark and burning with something between fury and fascination. That anomaly, he'll survive the bombardment.
But the civilians won't.
And when he realizes you killed them while he was still fighting. The sentence hung unfinished, but its conclusion painted itself across the bridge officers' imaginations. They'd all seen the footage, watched one person dismantle an Imperial battalion while laughing. What would that person do while angry?
Theranos swallowed. Then what do you propose? Kylo didn't answer immediately. The Force showed him branching possibilities, each path crackling with consequence.
In some timelines, they bombed the city and created a martyr whose legend would spread like wildfire. In others, they retreated and showed weakness that would embolden every rebellious impulse in the sector. In a rare few, they found a third option. More dangerous but infinitely more useful. We turn him, Kylo said quietly, the words tasting like betrayal to his own recent certainty. Someone with that much power operating outside Imperial structure will eventually become a problem too large to contain. But if we can redirect him... It was the first time Kylo had acknowledged that maybe, possibly, this anomaly couldn't simply be defeated. The admission felt like swallowing broken glass. On the planet's surface, Luffy sensed the immediate threat backing off and relaxed marginally. Citizens emerged from shelters, looking at him with expressions that mixed gratitude, awe, and the dawning realization that normal life had just been permanently disrupted by the walking natural disaster currently picking his nose with unself-conscious ease. An older woman approached, the same one who'd asked him about teaching them not to fear. She carried a bundle of food-dried meat, bread, things saved from rations that should have gone to families.
She offered it with trembling hand.
For you, she whispered.
For saving us.
Luffy's eyes lit up with joy so pure it was almost offensive.
Meat!
He devoured the offering with the table manners of a black hole, crumbs flying everywhere, gratitude expressed through enthusiastic chewing rather than words. The woman laughed, despite herself, despite the Imperial Star Destroyers still looming overhead, despite everything suggesting laughter was inappropriate. That laughter spread. Other citizens joined, bringing what little they had, creating an impromptu feast in ruins still smoking from battle. It wasn't logical they should be terrified, preparing for Imperial reprisal, fleeing to whatever safety existed under authoritarian occupation. Instead, they were breaking bread with a stranger who'd proven that the invincible could be punched. Above them, Imperial surveillance captured every moment. Officers watched the feeds, seeing something their training hadn't prepared them to process. People choosing joy in defiance of fear. Not organized resistance or ideological rebellion. Just humans deciding that maybe, possibly, the Empire's grip wasn't as absolute as they'd been taught. This was more dangerous than terrorism. This was hope, and hope metastasized. Kylo watched the feeds too, through the Force, his perception adding layers of emotional context. He felt the citizens' terror fading, replaced by something the dark side couldn't easily classify. Not the light side's serenity, this was messier, more chaotic. Joy mixed with uncertainty, hope contaminated by realism, but underneath it all, a growing belief that things didn't have to be the way they'd always been. And at the center of it all,
Luffy radiated contentment like a star radiates heat. No grand speeches, no ideological manifestos, no carefully constructed leadership. Just a guy eating food, grateful for kindness, fundamentally unchanged by having just fought an entire Imperial garrison to a standstill. The Force showed Kylo a vision. Himself at that table, eating with people instead of ruling over them, laughing instead of demanding fear, choosing connection over power. He saw Ben Solo's ghost, the part of him he'd murdered, asking quietly if strength gained through isolation was really strength or just elaborate loneliness. He crushed the vision with dark side fury, but it left traces he couldn't entirely erase. Theranos was issuing new orders, his strategy shifting to containment and propaganda control. If they couldn't eliminate the anomaly immediately, they'd control the narrative around him. Paint him as a dangerous radical, a threat to civilian safety, a chaos agent who'd doom the sector to anarchy. The Empire had refined this art over decades. Truth was malleable, and people believed what their survival required them to believe. But as surveillance continued, officers noticed something that made psychological warfare complicated. Luffy kept saving people. When looters tried to exploit the chaos, he stopped them not violently, just picking them up and placing them elsewhere like inconvenient furniture. When fire spread, he helped civilians evacuate, his stretchy body reaching into places rescuers couldn't access. When a child cried for a toy buried in rubble, he spent 20 minutes excavating it, grinning at the kid's joy like it was treasure. You couldn't easily paint someone as a monster when footage showed him returning children's toys. Theranos recognized the strategic problem. We need to force a choice, make him choose between his power and innocent lives, create a scenario where his intervention causes casualties. Kylo's head turned sharply. You're suggesting we manufacture atrocities to blame on him. I'm suggesting we reveal what he is, chaos incarnate, show the galaxy that freedom without control kills just as efficiently as tyranny. The dark side whispered agreement. The light side, Kylo constantly suppressed, screamed objection. And somewhere between those extremes, his actual thoughts churned with uncomfortable questions. What if they were right? What if order through fear really was the only way to prevent worse suffering? Or what if, and this was the thought he hated most, what if that laughing idiot was right, and everything Kylo had built his identity on was just trauma dressed as philosophy?
He made his decision. Prepare the scenario, but I execute it personally. This requires precision.
As Imperial plans formed, Luffy finished eating, patted his distended belly with satisfaction, and announced to no one in particular, I'm gonna go break that big scary ship now. It's making everyone nervous. The civilians tried to stop him, explaining about orbital bombardment capabilities, planetary defense shields, the impossibility of one person boarding a star destroyer. Luffy listened with the polite patience of someone who understood words were happening but couldn't quite grasp why they mattered. It'll be fine, he assured them, and launched himself skyward with gear second speed, body becoming a rocket aimed at impossibility. On the destroyer's bridge, alarms shrieked as sensors detected the impossible. An unidentified organic life form ascending through atmosphere without protection, trajectory aimed directly at their hull. And this was the part that made technicians question their instruments accelerating. Kylo felt him coming and smiled behind his broken mask.
Here we go.
Luffy hit the Star Destroyer's hull with the subtlety of a meteor and the precision of someone who'd never learned that space was supposed to be lethal to unprotected humans. His armament hacky-coated his body, creating a barrier that physics took one look at and decided not to argue with. He pressed his face against the transparasteel viewports, peering into corridors filled with shocked stormtroopers, and waved cheerfully before punching through several meters of military-grade durasteel like it was soggy cardboard. Alarms achieved pitches that approached music, sirens layering over each other in a symphony of everything is wrong.
Technicians shouted readings that made no sense.
Hull breach but no explosive decompression, internal penetration but no weapons signature. Threat level climbing beyond maximum thresholds because their systems literally couldn't calculate what to do with.
Laughing guy punching everything.
Luffy stretched through corridors, his rubber body elongating around corners, bouncing off walls, treating the galaxy's most feared military architecture like a particularly fun playground. Stormtroopers fired frantically, blaster bolts sparking off his Haki-protected flesh or passing harmlessly through stretched rubber. He didn't kill them, didn't even seem angry, just knocked them aside with the casual efficiency of someone clearing inconvenient furniture. "Where's the food storage?" he asked a terrified officer, holding the man upside down by his ankle.
"I'm still kinda hungry."
The officer, suspended and certain he was about to die, found his mouth answering before his brain approved. "Deck 7, Section 12. "Thanks!" Luffy dropped him gently and bounded off in that direction, leaving the officer to question every life choice that led to this moment. Kylo Ren felt the chaos spreading through his commandeered vessel and moved to intercept, but differently this time. Not with rage, not with the intention to dominate, but with something approaching respect for a worthy opponent. The Force guided him through corridors, and he dismissed stormtroopers before they could pointlessly throw themselves at the anomaly. This confrontation needed to be personal. They met in a hangar bay, vast space filled with dormant TIE fighters, and the echo of their previous battle still fresh in metaphysical memory. Luffy was holding a comically large sandwich he'd apparently assembled from the mess hall, chewing enthusiastically while looking around with tourist-like curiosity. "This ship is huge," he observed around a mouthful of food.
"You guys compensating for something?"
Kylo's lightsaber ignited. "You can't keep doing this. Chaos without purpose destroys everything, including what you're trying to protect." Luffy swallowed, considering.
"I'm not trying to create chaos. I'm just doing what feels right.
Those people down there needed help. Now you guys need to stop being jerks." "It's pretty simple. Nothing is simple." Kylo's voice cracked with frustration. "Every action has consequences that ripple across systems. The Empire maintains order because without order, there's only suffering. Your freedom kills just as much as our control." "Then your control sucks," Luffy replied with devastating simplicity. "If your peace needs people to be scared and sad, that's not peace. That's just being a bully with better ships." The words hit harder than any punch. Kylo felt them reverberate through the Force, through the dark side ideology he'd built his identity upon, through every justification he'd ever made for choosing power over compassion. And in that moment, fractures appeared in his certainty hairline, cracks in the foundation of who he'd convinced himself he was. But admitting that meant admitting everything, that he'd murdered his father for a lie, that he'd abandoned his mother for a fantasy, that he'd destroyed Ben Solo for a destiny that was really just trauma with narrative structure. The emotional cost of that admission was more than he could pay. So he attacked, pouring everything into the assault, decades of training, raw Force power, desperation dressed as determination. His lightsaber became a crimson blur, each strike aimed with killing intent and technical perfection. He augmented his speed with the Force, his strength with dark side rage, creating a hurricane of violence that should have overwhelmed any opponent. Luffy met him with gear forth, his body transforming into a muscular, bouncing form that treated Kylo's killing intent as an invitation to a really serious sparring match. They clashed across the hangar, destroying TIE fighters as collateral damage, their battle shaking the Star Destroyer's frame. Observation Haki versus Force precognition, armament Haki versus lightsaber, rubber physics versus space magic. Neither could decisively win because they were fighting on fundamentally different levels.
Kylo was trying to prove a philosophy.
Luffy was just trying to stop someone from hurting people. One was existential crisis with a lightsaber, the other was Saturday afternoon with mild exercise. Around them, the Star Destroyer's crew faced a different battle. Tarlonis Prime's population had armed themselves with Imperial weapons left behind during Luffy's earlier rampage, and were launching a coordinated assault on remaining ground forces. Not because Luffy told them to, but because his example had reminded them that authority could be questioned, that power could be resisted, that maybe their fear was a choice they'd been making daily and could stop making. Rebellion wasn't spreading through ideological conversion. It was spreading through inspired audacity. Theranos watched his control evaporating in real time, each report another nail in the coffin of imperial inevitability. planets and neighboring systems were receiving transmissions about Tarlani's Prime, about the man who laughed at star destroyers, about civilians who stood up and lived. The carefully maintained illusion of invincibility was shattering, and illusions once broken don't easily repair. "Prepare the planetary siege cannon," he ordered, voice hollow. "If we can't contain this through force, we'll glass the planet as an example to others." The order spread through the chain of command, officers executing protocols while privately questioning whether they were serving order or just serving fear with better uniforms. Kylo felt the decision through the Force, felt the gathering destructive power, the millions of lives about to be erased to prove a point. And in that moment, suspended mid-combat with a pirate who treated existential threats like inconveniences, something inside him snapped. Not broke, snapped back into place, like a dislocated joint forcefully reset. He saw his grandfather's legacy clearly for the first time. Not the power of Darth Vader, but the tragedy of Anakin Skywalker, a man who chose fear over love and suffered eternally for it. He saw his own path extending forward, an infinity of violence justified by increasingly hollow ideology, becoming more machine than man until nothing human remained worth saving. He saw Ben Solo's ghost asking quietly, "Is this really strength?" Kylo Ren made a choice. Possibly the first real choice he'd made since taking that name. He disengaged from Luffy, turning toward the hangar's exit, calling over his shoulder, "The Empire's about to destroy that planet. I'm going to stop them. You coming?" Luffy's eyes narrowed, sandwich forgotten.
Try and stop.
They ran together, the knight who'd finally questioned his chains, and the pirate who'd never worn any, toward a confrontation, where two impossible forces would collide with authoritarian machinery and prove that destiny was less fixed than people believed. The bridge of the Imperial Star Destroyer had never been designed for what happened next. Two opposing impossibilities arriving together with shared purpose. Kylo Ren strode through the doors he'd been given access to. Luffy crashed through the wall because doors were suggestions. Officers reached for weapons, then froze as Kylo's hand raised, not in attack, but in command.
"Stand down," he ordered.
Then, before the airness could respond, Kylo's lightsaber moved in a red arc that severed the siege cannon's control terminal in a shower of sparks and permanently offline targeting systems.
"What are you? You're committing treason,"
Theranos sputtered, face cycling through shades of red that suggested imminent cardiovascular failure. "No," Kylo said quietly, his mask fully removed now, young face exposed, and somehow looking more human than it had in years. "I'm committing sanity. This ends. The bombardment, the occupation, the terror as policy. It ends because continuing proves we're exactly the monsters they say we are." Luffy punched a hole through the secondary command console for emphasis, grinning. "Yeah, what he said. Also, you guys are being jerks, and I don't like it." The moment crystallized, officers looking between their authority structures, uncertain which fear was greater. The Empire's punishment for disobedience, or the consequences of opposing a Knight of Ren and whatever that rubber anomaly was. Centuries of hierarchical conditioning warred with basic survival instinct. Theranos drew a blaster. Luffy's stretched arm disarmed him before the weapon fully cleared its holster, the casual speed making the Grand Moff's attempt look like slow-motion comedy. He stood there, suddenly powerless, and the Empire's facade crumbled around him. "Retreat to hyperspace," Kylo commanded the crew.
"Spread the word. Tarlonis Prime is under new protection. Any Imperial retaliation will be discouraged."
The phrasing was diplomatic. The Force-enhanced threat underneath it was not. Ships began jumping to light speed, the Imperial fleet scattering like roaches when the light turns on. Within hours, Tarlonis Prime stood free, not through organized revolution or military conquest, but because one man laughed at tyranny and another finally stopped lying to himself about what strength really meant. Kylo and Luffy stood on the planet's surface, surrounded by celebrating citizens who weren't entirely sure what to do with freedom after generations without it.
Children ran past, laughing.
Adults embraced, crying. Someone started singing an old song about hope that had been banned decades ago.
"What happens now?" Kylo asked quietly, watching joy he'd forgotten existed.
Luffy stretched, utterly unconcerned with grand implications. I'm gonna find my crew, and some meat, and more adventure, you know, the usual. Just like that, you upend an empire and move on? I didn't upend anything, I just punched the bad guys. You're the one who changed.
Luffy's grin turned knowing, wise despite its simplicity. You stop trying to be someone you're not, that's way harder than punching.
Kylo had no response because the observation was devastatingly accurate. He'd spent years cultivating darkness, and this laughing fool had unraveled it in days just by existing differently.
Not by being stronger, though he was.
Not by being smarter, though he had a disturbing kind of wisdom. Just by being completely, utterly himself without apology or doubt.
I can't undo what I've done, Kylo said, voice raw.
The people I've killed, my father, then don't undo it. Fix it going forward.
Luffy made it sound simple because to him it was.
You messed up, so stop messing up, start doing better. It's not complicated. It was the worst therapy and the most profound wisdom, delivered by someone who probably couldn't spell philosophy if his life depended on it. As days passed, the galaxy learned what happened when the narrative of invincibility shattered. Tarlonis Prime became a symbol, its story spreading through underground channels and official reports equally. The Empire scrambled to contain the damage, but you can't unbreak an illusion. Planets started questioning. Rebellious thoughts became rebellious words, became rebellious actions. Luffy eventually found his way back home, the Force Nexus opening one last time to return him to his ocean and crew. He left without fanfare, taking nothing but memories and a new scar collection. The people of Tarlonis Prime built a statue not to worship, but to remember that authority is only as powerful as people's belief in it. Kylo Ren, maybe Ben Solo again, the name still uncertain, walked a harder path. Atonement without applause, redemption without reset button, facing every person he'd hurt without the mask to hide behind. Some days he wished for the simplicity of darkness, when feeling nothing meant never having to feel guilt. But he continued forward because the alternative was betraying the one real choice he'd made in years. On clear nights, when the galaxy felt vast and his burden unbearable, he'd remember a laugh that mocked impossibility. Remember a pirate who proved freedom wasn't something destiny granted, but something will created. And he'd keep walking, one step at a time, toward becoming someone who could laugh at his own chains and mean it. The legend grew, a pirate who came from nowhere, fought an empire to a standstill, and left having changed nothing and everything.
No prophecy, no chosen one narrative.
Just a man in a straw hat who decided people mattered more than power structures, and lived that truth so completely the universe had to adjust.
The empire fractured. Hope spread.
And somewhere across the stars, Luffy was laughing, chasing his next adventure, completely unaware he'd become mythology.
Which was exactly how he'd want it.